Western authors of this. One of the most important authors was a Lebanese Christian, but not a Maronite Christian, a Roman Christian, a very odd little breed, in Lebanon, named Charles Malik, M-A-L-I-K. He, like the other writers who weren't from Europe, had a Western education. And clearly this legalistic tradition, this idea of a declaration, grows out of the tradition we've been talking about. But it also speaks to the sort of thing that Fanon speaks to negatively, this speaks to it positively. Many of the people from these colonized parts of the world came to the West and learned a great deal of stuff, which they took back in all sorts of different ways to change their countries, to make revolutions, and so forth. Right? So I'm trying to explain, in other words, it's not that there's a West which does this and the rest of the world do this. But in any case, these people are Western trained because this document is written in the tradition we've been talking about. So Malik was a philosopher and a teacher. He was a Lebanese foreign minister in the 1950s. He was an important political figure. He went to mission schools in Lebanon, which in some sense speaks also to the power of liberal Christianity in the development of human rights discourse in the late 19th and the 20th century. He got his PhD from Harvard. The Chinese delegate, a nationalist Chinese delegate named P.C. Chang, again Western educated, PhD at Columbia, a musician, a poet, but again, is he Western? Well, no, he's one of the most famous exponents of Chinese literary traditions in the public sphere in China. So a person who lives between these, or in the midst of these traditions. So it was written by a group of educated men and women, trained in law, trained in religion, trained in public policy. Yeah. Well, I just know, it's back, the question was, these authors all Western educated, couldn't you argue that it comes from the West? Well, you can, and it does in one sense, in the notion that the United Nations was founded in San Francisco, right? It's growing out of a tradition of legalism and so forth, which is Western, which is Enlightenment. There's no question about that. But on the other hand, you read Fanon, where does his tradition come from? It comes from Marx. Where does the Chinese Revolution come from? It comes from Marx. Where does the Japanese Revolution come? It comes from German 19th century philosophy, right? Where does the Indian independence movement come from? Well, Gandhi is deeply steeped in a certain version of Hinduism. He's also deeply steeped in Tolstoy. I mean, so we don't have a world in which there's, this hermetic Western tradition that no one else could possibly use, and when anyone else uses it, it's not them anymore, is what I would want to say. Do you have Andrea, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've talked about this age of imperialism and what it created is this sort of hybrid formation, right? Where, people who are coming out of, the non-Euro-American context are appropriating what they want out of this Euro-American heritage, and then, we see with Fanon, as an example, using it against, these received structures. Yeah.
Right. So it was, you guys, there's an irony. I mean, Fanon, if you guys read it, you just read a few paragraphs, you get it that Fanon writes as a Marxist. I mean, he keeps relating the worker alienation from colonial alienation. He writes as someone who's trained in psychoanalysis, right? So, the irony of this, here's a guy who writes this, we'll get to the document, important, interesting, pained and painful document. But there's no question, if you ask the question, where does this come from? It comes from the West. It comes from little parts of the West. It comes from a particular sort of high modernist Jewish tradition. It comes from Marx and Freud. I mean, that's where, right? There's very little Islam in Fanon. Okay? So there's a famous quote of Gandhi's when someone asked him, what do you think about Western civilization? He said, it's great. It's just I'm waiting for it to happen, or something like that. And what he meant by that, it was not that Gandhi and Nehru and his colleagues were anti-Western per se. They were deeply steeped in Western intellectual traditions. They thought the West had betrayed these traditions, and the particular forces of the West were on their side, which they were. So that's what I'm trying to say. The world is so interconnected intellectually and culturally by the early 20th century that it's very hard to say this or that. Is that And I think, as you'll see in a moment, within the West, there are also changes, and that gets you to that we talked about who wrote the Declaration. I've just told you that, and then the question here you sort of see two of its prominent figures. So this is not this is multi-gendered, multi-ethnic, a multinational group of people who do it. But all of these people are actually people who can talk this language of a legal document. Right? Is that in a certain tradition? And I can tell you, I mean, I remember this as a kid. It was a big deal, the signing of this declaration, and I'll show you other ways in which this is culturally expressed in a moment. Well, who's the subject of this document? Again, I hope you'll read it. The subject is individual men and women, individuals, persons, but also groups that have rights. It's Cassin, one of the writers, René Cassin, C-A-S-S-I-N, likened the document to the portico of a Greek temple. It had a preamble, set out the reasons for the declaration. Then it had a set of columns which talked about it, which he related to the articles, some on individual rights, then on rights to humans in political and civil society, then to spiritual and political rights, and finally social, economic, and cultural rights. So the document was meant to be very, very broad and encompassing, far broader in many ways than the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, or the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence, to include the sort of demands that the socialist movements of the 19th century made for cultural and economic and social well-being, as well as for individual well-being and for the negative freedoms. Okay, so that's who the subject is. Now I want to just say one more thing about its founding. 51 nations were at the conference. No one voted against it. It passed 48 to 0. I get the numbers wrong. It passed 48 to 0. And then there were 8. So it must have been 56 nations were at the conference. 56 nations were at the conference. Now, who voted against this? This is interesting in terms of West and East. Voting against it was the Soviet Union and the communist countries of the Eastern Bloc. So Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. Votes against it? What? Well, no one voted against it. They abstained. So they abstained on the grounds that you read about in Stephen Luke's article, that all this stuff about individual rights and political rights mean nothing in the context of inequality. Who else voted against it? South Africa, for reasons but race, as you were clear, and Saudi Arabia on the issue of women's rights and issues of religious freedom. So that sort of splits up. It's not West versus someone else. It's overtly colonial power, South Africa. It's a certain interpretation of the Islamic heritage, Saudi Arabia, and political. And it's the socialist West who votes against it, abstains, right? So that's in itself an interesting configuration. I hope you, and that puts a lie to the East-West distinction, I think. Okay, so let's see what this declaration, I see skeptical faces, but we'll talk about it. So let's look at how it's. Can you hold on just a second? Yes, sorry. I just need to know where I was. So what does it say and on what basis? I'm going to tell you, and we're going to go over briefly what it said. You can read about it, but I just want to, I'll just want to sketch it. But I do want to spend a little more time talking about its foundations. So its foundations are very much ones you are by now familiar with, I hope. The principles of the Enlightenment, the universalist principles of the Enlightenment. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. You've heard this. You've heard this in different contexts. You heard it in Locke, you heard it in the Declaration of Independence, you heard it in the French Declaration, you've heard this a bunch of times. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason. You notice it doesn't say that God endowed them with reason. They are endowed with reason. They use the passive construction. With reason and conscience, and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. That's what they say. And we're going to hear this again in this lecture in other contexts. We're going to hear this in the papal encyclical, where they are endowed with this by God, and where it goes out of natural rights. But what it says in the papal encyclical and what it says in the secular, multi-religious, multicultural declaration are essentially the same thing with different arguments about foundation. Second article is also sort of a building block of the old sorts. It says everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinctions of any kind such as race, color, sex, religion, language, political opinions, national social origins, property, birth, or status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of a country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it's an independent territory, a trust territory, a non-self-governing territory, or any other kind of place with limited sovereignty. In other words, this really is universal, and it applies to every place, including states that are, as Angola was at this time, states that are still colonial states, states that are mandates, and so forth. Right? So it really does make this universal claim based on the principles that we have been talking about. And again, I want to emphasize that it puts on the international agenda equality of race and equality of gender. So while we've talked about the feminist issue in the 19th century as a national issue, and we talked about a little bit in the context with Miller of these health rights and rights of personhood and the sort of problems that international organizations dealing with women on these issues from a legal point of view, feminist aspirations are crucial. And the guys who wrote this declaration understood that human development depends on racial equality, certainly, but also equal gender access. So it's a key notion, and it's a much debated notion, a much politically controverted notion, but I want to just emphasize it is put on the political agenda now. It's there to be controverted. That's, I think, in my view, an important move. Now, I don't think I want to go through. I mean, I was prepared to go through each of these these articles. I just want to so you could do this yourself, but I just want to suggest to you how much these are ones you know about now written on a larger stage. So everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. No one shall be held in slavery. No one should be subjected to torture. Everyone has equal recognition before the law. In other words, there are all these ideas of the rule of law, freedom from torture, freedom from, that we've heard in individual constitutions in Europe, in Latin America, now writ into an international constitution, including not being subjected to arbitrary arrest and so forth. So I would like you to just look at those and sort of try to map what this says onto what you know about when we talked about constitutions and Enlightenment ideals in earlier lectures. So where does this come from politically? Well, the two contexts. I actually think that race, far more than gender, is